That sound there.
Good evening. Hello. How's it going? Thank you all for coming out. I just want to ask if there's honor students here that need to make proof that you're here, see me after. But it's good to see some of my students, some new faces, some old faces. Thank you for coming. And on behalf of Paradise Valley Community College and the PVCC Philosophical Society, welcome. And I'm going to introduce to you tonight Dr. Peter Redpath. He is a historian of philosophy, a Thomist scholar, and author of several books, and he's also a member of our community. He and I are going to be partnering together to bring more public philosophy to the local area. So I would like to introduce Dr. Peter Redpath. Peter Redpath.
Thank you very much for coming to this historic meeting. I call it historic because Dr. Hancock and I have been involved in events internationally, philosophical congresses, going back to the 1980s. In fact, one of the first ones was in Tempe, Arizona, around 1980, where we started to engage in a program for attempting to recover Western philosophy and reconnect philosophy and science and wisdom. And I said it's an historic event because we, in each of these meetings that we held in various venues, ranging from places like Poland and in Warsaw and Lublin, or in Rome, or in France and Germany. They're all part of that project. And a few years ago, I set up this school called the Aquinas School of Leadership to engage in leadership training. And as part of that organization, you can check that out online if you want to get background on that and on me. A short while ago, we decided to have a lecture series, and this is the inaugural lecture in that Aquinas School of Leadership lecture series that Dr. Kelly Fitzsimmons-Burton has graciously invited us, along with Paradise Valley Community College and the Philosophical Society, to deliver here. So that's one of the that's a special event within all of these historic events that I've been mentioning. Dr. Hancock is an internationally recognized scholar. He holds a Freeman Chair in philosophy at Rockhurst Jesuit University. He's also a graduate of the University of Oklahoma, among other places, where he was there on a track scholarship. So he's quite an athlete, among other things.
Many years ago.
Very well-rounded human being, and one of the nicest persons that you'd ever want to meet and have as a professional colleague and a friend. Two of his specialties are in metaphysics and in ethics. And what I want to do now is to introduce Dr. Hancock to you so he can talk to you about St. Thomas and Aristotle and what you might be able to learn. We all might be able to learn from them about human happiness.
About happiness, yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Redpath. Yes, I'm happy to be here, and that's precisely what I'm going to do, talk about happiness. And I'm going to use St. Thomas Aquinas and Aristotle as my guide as we try to explore the nature of happiness. But I'm not going to talk about them just because there are a couple of venerable names from the past. There's this tendency, to revere people because they become like museum pieces. Aristotle, a philosopher in the 4th century BC. St. Thomas Aquinas, philosopher in the 13th century. But I myself I'm very interested in the history of philosophy, but not because I just have an antiquarian interest, because I'm interested in things in the past. A philosopher named Etienne Gilson once said that what you should be interested in always is a living philosophy. And he argued that some of the greatest living philosophers are people who died even a couple of millennia ago. Someone like Aristotle, and almost a millennium ago, someone like Thomas Aquinas. They're worth talking about because they're still very relevant. They're as timely as ever. And that's why I'm going to talk to them, talk about them to you. Aristotle said long ago that everybody wants to be happy, but if you observe, not a lot of people spend a lot of time exploring what happiness means. And it's important to think about what happiness is and how to get it. And if you also think about happiness, you have to think about the things that can get in your way about being happy, the pitfalls that can prevent you from being happy. And so I'm going to provide some observations that emanate out of the pages of the work of St. Thomas Aquinas and Aristotle that will help us answer some of those questions and remedy some of those deficiencies, avoiding pitfalls especially. Let's see if I can get here. This is a famous centerpiece of a painting by Raphael in the 16th century, Plato and Aristotle. The painting is called The School of Athens, and there are hundreds of philosophers depicted in that painting. And right at the center is Plato and Aristotle coming down a staircase. And you'll notice Plato is pointing to the heavens, and Aristotle is affirming this world. And that's one of the reasons I think Aristotle is such an effective guide for happiness. Aristotle thought theories were always guilty until proven innocent. He's very interested in practical experience and how people can find their way in the world. In fact, the book he's holding there is his book on ethics. Plato is holding a book on metaphysics, and so Raphael knew enough about philosophy to contrast the two. And this is Thomas Aquinas. There are a lot of old stodgy pictures of Thomas Aquinas. I always like this one. This is a picture of him as a young seminarian, and that's actually painted by Peter Paul Rubens, so it's a great work of art, I always believed. So I'm going to talk about some of the wisdom about happiness that comes out of these volumes. One by Aristotle, the Nicomachean Ethics. His father's name was Nicomachus, and his son's name was Nicomachus. So the name Nicomachean Ethics does double duty. And the emphasis on family is part of the pathway into understanding the nature of happiness for Aristotle. Excuse me. For Aristotle, so it's not a surprise that he titled his book that way. And St. Thomas's work on happiness, because they both thought that ethics is a way to understand the pursuit of happiness. So these are books on ethics, but ethics is another way of understanding happiness. So that's why we use them as our source. He wrote a commentary on Aristotle's Ethics, and that's the source book for our understanding of his view of happiness. He wrote about 8 million words, St. Thomas did. He died before he was 50 years old and wrote 8 million words. So he wrote a lot on happiness, as you can imagine, but a very condensed explanation of his account of happiness can be found in that book. And Dennis Prager, that's a name you probably know. He's got a talk show there out of San Diego. I read this book recently, Happiness is a Serious Problem, and he doesn't mention Aristotle or St. Thomas in the book, but it's just chock full of some interesting examples and some themes. And I knew I'd read it recently, so I wanted to give him credit because I knew it was going to come out in my talk, some of the examples he gives. In outline, this is basically what I'm going to do. And the first item is happiness is a moral obligation. In fact, Dennis Prager titles that as the first chapter of his book, the first chapter in his book, and I think that's a nice starting point because Aristotle was very much endorsed thinking of happiness as a moral obligation. And there are two reasons that happiness is a moral obligation. The first is that you owe it to yourself to be happy. Why do you owe it to yourself to be happy? Because you ought to be all that you can be. You ought to be the kind of person that nature intended you to be. The kind of excellent example of human nature, of the human person. So emphasis on human nature is big in Aristotle's conception of happiness. Also, you should care about happiness, or happiness is a moral obligation, because you're not born into this world for yourself alone, so you should care about the happiness of others. Okay? So Aristotle, if you asked him what his profession was, he would not have told you he was a philosopher. He would have told you that he was a biologist. He was keenly interested in biology, and he came by that interest honestly, because his father, and his father before him, were men of medicine. They were medical doctors. In fact, Aristotle's father, Nicomachus, was court physician to one of the most powerful men in the world, Philip of Macedon. That name may not ring a bell, but his son was Alexander the Great. So if Aristotle grew up in the court of Philip of Macedon, he knew Alexander the Great. He ran with fast company, and he had a friendship with Alexander the Great all of Alexander's life. And Alexander died in 323 BC, and Aristotle died in 322 BC, and that wasn't entirely a coincidence. Because he grew up in a household where medicine was important, he was a very keen observer of nature and biological issues, and he had biological interest to the end of his life. And in fact, when Alexander went eastward to conquer the world, he would sometimes send back to Aristotle curious biological specimens that he found in the plant kingdom and the animal kingdom. So it's more than just a hobby for Aristotle, his interest in biology. In fact, Darwin said, as he studied biology and different biologists historically, he said that next to him, Darwin, he thought Aristotle arguably was the best biologist. So that's an interesting fact about Aristotle. Now, the reason that's relevant is because Aristotle ties in happiness with the biology of being a human being. There's an old saying in ethics that as a person's philosophy of the human person goes, so goes one's ethics, and so goes one's account of happiness. And so that's another way of saying that you have to know what it is to be a human being, to know how a human being ought to live his or her life, to know how a human being ought to be happy. And Aristotle basically took that to the bank. So for him, happiness is something that's species-specifically human. If you think about it, that's just common sense. And Aristotle is the great champion of common sense philosophy. As I said before, he doesn't really have much truck for just theories. He's interested in having both feet on the ground. He even has an expression where he said that there's nothing in your intelligence that's not first in your senses. That's why in that portrait with Plato there, he's affirming this world. He's grounded in sense experience. And he believes that human beings are species-specifically destined for happiness, or they have the capacity for happiness in a way that the other animals do not. If you think about it, this is just common sense, animals are interested in avoiding pain, and they're interested in having satisfaction in life, but they don't understand what happiness is. They wouldn't be equipped to have the self-reflection necessary to know what happiness is. And that's Aristotle's point, that happiness is something unique to human life. And because it's specific to human life, you have to be careful to understand what happiness will entail. Because people often make mistakes about what happiness is, he says. A lot of people think happiness is just feeling good, that you feel good at this time, or you feel good at that time. But he says that is not what happiness is, because again, that seems to run afoul of common sense. If you think about it, that's true. So at 1 o'clock, I feel very happy. At 2 o'clock, I don't feel so hot. At 3, I feel anxious. At 4, I'm depressed. Hey, at 5, I'm back to being euphoric. Well, then my happiness would be on a kind of yo-yo. And Aristotle says that can't be how we understand happiness philosophically. Happiness has to be something stable and permanent, something that endures, so we can understand how a human being is developing toward his or her happiness. Also, happiness is not the same as having fun. Having fun is something, again, very transient, and it lacks that permanence necessary, Aristotle thought, for a common sense grasp of happiness. Happiness is also not the same as success. He thinks a lot of people mistake happiness for that. But it's not the same as success because often you will meet people who are very successful and you sense they're unhappy.